Phil here. This is going to be a quick video on activity-based costing. Activity-based costing, ABC as we sometimes call it. So let's jump right into it. So the first thing we're going to talk about is overhead cost allocation methods. So remember, you're always going to have your materials, you're always going to have your labor, and you're always going to have your overhead. Now remember, the overhead is basically, if it doesn't fit into the materials or the labor category, then it's going to go into the overhead. So the overhead is kind of the all the indirect stuff, if you will. And then, of course, we also have direct materials and we have direct labor going into goods in process. So think of goods in process. Sometimes they'll call that work in process. Think of the assembly line, right? Think about stuff working its way down the assembly line. And then we'll have finished goods. Think about the warehouse stuff sitting there, it hasn't been sold yet, but we're hoping to sell it soon. And then once we do sell it, it's transferred to cost of goods sold. All right, so let's start off by talking, just to kind of set this up a little bit, a summary of the different types of allocation methods. So the easiest one, this is probably a good one if the company there isn't really a lot of variance in their products, or maybe they just produce one thing, which is probably unlikely. They could just use a plant-wide rate for allocating overhead. And if they were to do that, then they would use something like direct labor hours or perhaps machine hours, depending on the level of mechanization in the plant to allocate the overhead. So if they had more people, they might use, okay, well, let's use direct labor hours. If they've got a lot more machines, they might say, well, let's use machine hours. The point being, they would just use one rate for the overhead rate for the whole factory. Now, if you want to be a little more precise, you could switch to a departmental rate, which is what it sounds like, right? Every department has its own overhead rate. So this is why it says two or more rates. Now here, we would still use things like direct labor hours or again, machine hours. So let's say like Department A has a lot of people, not many machines. So we might say, well, let's use direct labor hours, right? People. Whereas say Department B has more machine hours. So we might say, well, let's use machine hours. They have more machines. So we might say, let's use machine hours, right? So some of it's going to be driven by, what is the kind of the predominant cost driver in that department. Now, what we're going to be focusing on in this video is activity-based costing. Now, notice it says many rates, right? It doesn't really tell you a whole lot there. Come over to the right, and it says activities that drive costs, like number of batches of product produced. So what we're going to really be doing in this video is we're going to be talking about this idea that activity-based costing is really like having a departmental, we're going away from a departmental rate or a plant-wide rate, and we're having an overhead rate for each individual activity. Now, of course, a lot of these activities are kind of like bunched together. Otherwise, you'd have, a gazillion overhead rates. But think of it like all these activities that have to happen that constitute the overhead. We're going to have a different overhead rate, a predetermined overhead rate for each individual activity. So this is the plant-wide overhead rate. This is the simplest one. So the cost object is, of course, the unit of product. The allocation base, like we said, would typically be direct labor hours or machine hours. And it's a pretty simple calculation for this one. Total budgeted overhead costs divided by the allocation base. Again, whether that be direct labor hours or machine hours. The same rate is used to assign overhead costs to all the products. Okay, which you can probably start to think about the issue there. Well, what if product A uses a lot of overhead and product B doesn't use a lot of overhead, but they just get the same allocation? So we actually call that, there's a name we have for that, it's called product cross-subsidization. The idea that one product is really subsidizing another one because it's taking a lot of its overhead that it shouldn't. So looking at the overhead rate for the whole plant, this is where we just got one overhead rate for the whole plant. All we're going to do here is very simple. In this example, the total budgeted overhead cost, 4.8 million. The direct labor hours that they budgeted is 100,000 hours. So we're just going to divide these two. You'll see that shortly. And then they're showing you down here the actual usage. Now this company is producing, hypothetical obviously, two types of go-karts, right? Standard and custom. Obviously they're going to make more standards, 5,000 versus 1,000 customs. But if you notice, the custom is going to take more direct labor hours, right? 10 more compared to the standard. So then you've got the direct labor hours that they're going to use over here. This is where they're getting the 100,000 from. They're really just saying A quarter of it will go into the custom. The other 3/4 will go to direct labor hours will go to the standard go-karts. Here you see the calculation, right? 4.8 million divided by the 100,000, and we get this quotient here of $48 per direct labor hour. So just real quick, let's talk about what that means. What it means, very simply, is that for every direct labor hour, every one direct labor hour that the factory incurs, they're going to charge $48 for the overhead. So let's say you come into work and you work 10 hours that day, then it would be 48 times 10, 480. So it's pretty straightforward. Okay, so this is, you can see down here, overhead allocated equals plant-wide overhead rate times direct labor as used. And they got a couple of examples down here, right? You notice that the 48 is the same because remember it's just one rate for the whole plant. And then what's driving this, what's driving it is the number of hours worked. So like 15 in the case of standard, 25 in the case of custom. All right, so we're looking. This is like a different way of kind of showing it. This was, if you remember, this was the total overhead. They had 4.8 million like total overhead cost for the factory. So we took the 4.8, we divided it by the 100,000 direct labor hours. We got the $48 per direct labor hour. I'm sure you remember that. And then this is just showing how they split it up, right? So we got standard on the left, custom on the right. So you can see here, 720 per unit went to standard. 1,200 per unit went to custom. So that's kind of telling us that, the custom appears to be a little more intense, if you will, intensive when it comes to the overhead. Down here, you can see the product costs. You can see the materials, the labor, and the overhead. Let me just say real quick that whenever you're looking at activity-based costing, don't misunderstand it and think that we're also talking about materials and labor. We're only talking about overhead. Materials and labor, you're going to do like you've done in any other scenario. So materials and labor here, obviously these numbers were just given to you, and you can see where they added in the 720 from up there, the 1,200 from up there. And then they've come up with their product costs per unit. Obviously not what they're selling it for. They would obviously add a margin onto that to make some money. But that represents their costs based on the plant-wide. So what if we said, well, we don't want to use the plant-wide rate. We want to use, we don't want to have like one rate for the whole factory. We want to have one for each department. So this is what they're showing you here, right? The overhead cost, Department A and B. We have Department A is going to have its own overhead rate, and Department B is as well. And then the arrows here are just really showing you that, both products, product 1 and 2, are going to need stuff from Department A and B, right? So both product 1 and 2 are going to have overhead from A and also Department A and also Department B. So here we see, just like before, the overhead cost for the whole overhead cost for the whole factory was 4.8. What they've done here is they've broken it up into machining 4.2 and assembly 600. So straight away we can see, okay, well, machining is apparently using pretty much all of the overhead, which makes sense because it's machining. Assembly, not so much, right? It's a whole lot lower, 600,000 versus 4.2. For step 2, what we're going to do now is, first thing we're going to do is we'll look up here. We can see the number of units, right? 5,000 for the standard versus 1,000 for the custom. They have $10 or 10 machine hours per unit, 20 machine hours per unit. So again, the custom is taking double the number of machine hours than the standard, right? So we've got 50,000 machine hours for the standard. We've got 20,000 for the custom in the machining department. And then, of course, over here, you kind of see where it kind of changes a little bit, right? Now they're using direct labor hours. 15 direct labor hours, 25 direct labor hours, right? Then we come down to the calculation. Departmental overhead rate. We're just going to take the budgeted departmental overhead cost and we're going to divide it by whatever the allocation base is for that department. So if you remember, think about this 4.2. This was the overhead cost for machining, and then the 600,000 overhead costs for assembly. So you can see what they did here, right? For machining, we took the 4.2, and then we divided it by the total number of machine hours for machining, 70,000, and we get $60 per machine hour. So for every machine hour that is run in the machining departments, they're going to allocate $60 to cover the overhead. For the assembly department, we took the 600,000, again, right here. They divided it by the 100,000 direct labor hours from up here, and we have $6 per direct labor hour. What that's saying is for every direct labor hour that somebody works, they're going to apply $6 to cover the overhead. And then in step 3, all we're going to do now is we're just going to say, okay, well, let's go ahead and figure out our amounts. So you can see the $60 per machine hour, $6 per direct labor hour, and then we're just saying, okay, well, how many hours did like machine hours? In this case, it was 10 for the standard, 20 for the custom. So think of it like 60 per machine hour times 10 is your 600. 60 times the 20 is going to be your 1200. And then for direct labor hours, conversely, $6 times 15 is your 90. $6 times 25 for the custom is the 150. And then they're just going to add them up. So we're saying for the standard go-kart, for what it needs for machining and assembly, we should apply 690 to cover the overhead. And then for the custom go-kart, for the 2 departments, we should apply 1350 to cover the overhead. Excuse me. Now you can see below, kind of like they did before, they're just showing all 3 manufacturing components, right? Materials, labor, and overhead. And we have a total cost of 1440 versus 2450. Now, if I go back just real quick to here, you notice that it has changed a little bit, right? Total product cost per unit when we were looking at just having one plant-wide rate for the whole department was 1470, 2300. Now it's 1440 and 2450. So it isn't a whole lot different, but it is a little bit different. Okay. So plant-wide versus the departmental overhead rates, you can see here, you can kind of see how it's changed. All right, so let's get into the activity-based costing. So this is kind of the one where I was saying now we're gonna come up with basically a bunch of activities for the overhead. We're gonna look at the overhead and we're gonna try to kind of categorize it into different activities. And we're gonna have a different overhead rate for each individual activity. Okay, so ABC focuses on activities and follows 3 steps. So number 1, identify the activities and assign costs to the activity cost pools. And that will make sense a little bit further in the video if that term sounds all strange. Number 2, compute an overhead activity rate for each activity cost pool. And number 3, assign the overhead costs to the cost objects. So again, they always make these sound, whenever they're giving you like generic instructions, they always make it sound more complicated. I promise you, it's not that complicated. What you're seeing here is in the diagram below, overhead cost. And then you can see that in this case, they've got, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 different activities. So production, setup, design, and factory services. So what is the kind of the overhead rate, if you will, for production? They're using cost per direct labor hour. What is the quote-unquote overhead rate for setup? It's cost per setup. For design, it's cost per design change. Some of these probably make sense. And then for factory services, they're going to use cost per square foot. And you can see over here, these are the activities, these are the rates, and then these are the cost objects. Remember, cost objects, they just mean whatever you think of, whatever product you're building is a good way to think about it, right? Here we have two cost objects, standard go-kart and custom go-kart. All right, so step 1. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to identify the activities and their budgeted overhead cost. And then we kind of group them into these cost pools. Okay, so you can see here, you can see our 4 activities, right? Production, setup, design, and factory services. You can see the amounts. They've got 600,000 total costs for production. That's, again, these are budgeted numbers, right? This hasn't happened yet. 2 million for setup, 1.2 for design, $1 million for factory services. And you notice that sums to, you probably remember that number, right? 4.8. So now they're saying, okay, well, how many for like production? What was driving production? Direct labor hours, right? If we go back, production, cost per direct labor hour. So how many direct labor hours do they plan to use? 100,000. For setups, we had a budgeted cost of 2 million. They plan on doing 200 setups for the number of setups. Design, 1.2 budgeted for that. They anticipate having 10 design changes. And then factory services, 1 million. And they have square footage of 20,000 square feet. So you can probably see where this is heading. So then what we do is we look at if you look down here, we've got the standard model and we have the custom model. Now they're saying, okay, well, all these activities, like how many of each activity is going to be required for the standard model and also for the custom model. So we can see here direct labor hours. We know that there was 100,000, so they split it out, right? 75,000 is going to go to the standard model, 25 to the custom. For the 200 setups, 160 are going to be used by the custom model, 40 by the standard model. Design changes, everything is, there's going to be 10 of those, right? And they're all going to be used by the custom model. You can see 0 for the standard. And then square footage, 20,000 square feet total, 8,000 allocated to custom, 12,000 to standard. And then you can see what they're doing down here. They're taking these total costs like production, 600,000. Again, if you like, where do we get these numbers from? The 600, the 2 million. If we go back, it's just right here. So 600,000 divided by the 100,000 direct labor hours. So again, $6 per direct labor hour. And the same logic all the way down. We're now taking the total cost for that cost pool, if you will, and we're just dividing it by the number of, whatever's driving it. Like if we look at setup, total cost of 2 million divided by 200 setups. So every setup that they perform, they should charge 10,000, right? For every design change, we know this is 1.2 million allocated for design changes. They think they'll have 10. So for every one design change, they should allocate 120,000 to cover it. And it's the same logic for all of those. All right, for step 3. So now we're going to allocate the overhead cost to the cost objects. So that's kind of what they're doing down here, right? There is the formula. Allocated cost equals the actual activity usage times the times the activity rate. So that's kind of what they're doing here, right? They've split it out into standard and custom. You can see for production, you can see the 75,000 direct labor hours. You can see the 25,000 over here. You can see where they're plugged in the sixes. And then they're saying, okay, for allocated cost of production, 450,000 versus 150 over here. And it's the same logic all the way down. So if we pick another one like setups, we know that they had a total of 200 setups. If you remember, we go back right here, 200 setups. So you can say, okay, well, how was the 200 broken out? 160 setups for custom, 40 setups for standard. Again, it was $10,000 for each setup. So 400,000 is going to be allocated to the standard go-kart for setups. 1.6 million is going to be allocated to the custom go-kart. And it's the exact same logic for the last two down here. So based on this, we have a total allocated cost of 1.45 million for the standard go-kart, and we have 3.35 million for the custom. Then we just divide it by the number of units produced, which, if you remember, it was 5,000 standard go-karts and 1,000 customs. So then we get an overhead cost per unit of 290. And then we get a custom. Now look at the difference here. We get a custom allocated per unit cost of 33.50. So again, you can see that's very different. So now they're just plugging in. If you want to, this is kind of what we just talked about. They're just presenting it in a different way. Go over this if it helps you. But pay attention down at the very bottom, right? We've got the three things: materials, labor, overhead. What we're really looking at is the overhead. 290 for standard versus 33.50 for custom. So you can kind of see how different this method can be, right? So when we looked at the difference between like just having one departmental overhead rate versus one rate for the whole factory versus departmental rates, it was a little different, but it wasn't a whole lot different. And then we jump into the ABC, and you see this is way different in terms of the overhead allocation. So here if we look at the bottom here, we're comparing them, right? So we're looking at the standard go-kart. The plant-wide rate was 720. Departmental was 690. So again, it's not too different. And then activity-based jumps all the way down to 290, right? And then if we look at custom go-kart, again, 1200 versus 1350, not too different. But then if we do ABC, it goes way up. So you can think of ABC as a lot more, it's a lot more accurate. Again, it's good if there's a big variance, of types of things that they make. And, if you suspect that, different product lines are using vastly different amounts of overhead, ABC is probably a good method to use. But just notice how different it is under ABC. Now, ABC is a lot of work to set up, but it is much more accurate. So comparing overhead allocation methods for business decisions. So we'll talk about 1, 2, and 3 just real quick. So number 1, product unit cost is lower for the standard go-kart versus the custom. So we just noticed that on the last slide. The cost difference is largest using ABC. We just said that. And the more accurate overhead allocation leads to better product pricing and product mix decisions. So, having your products properly costed leads to having your products properly priced. And, some people say, well, it can't be that big of a difference. Well, it could be because think about things like price, like, in economics, they talk about price elasticity of demand. Right. So think about how that relates to something like this. If you realize that let's say that you're using like just a plant-wide rate, and you switched over to ABC, and you realize that for one of your products, you'd been allocating way too much overhead, so therefore the price had been higher. You switch over to ABC, and you say, okay, we could actually lower the price. And imagine that if you lowered the price, demand shoots way up, right? That's that kind of idea of like price elasticity of demand. All right, a couple other things, and then we're done on this video. Types of activities. This is very straightforward, but we'll just talk about it real quick. Again, this is activity-based costing. The types of activities are broken down as you see here. Unit level. So the idea of unit level is it's performed on each unit. Batch level is only performed in batches. Product level is performed on the product line, and then facility level, can sustain the facility capacity as a whole. So as some examples, so like as an example of a unit level activity, right? Cutting parts or assembling components. Again, you've got to do it to each individual unit, hence the name. Batch level, think about it. You just have to do it in batches, like setting up machines. You don't have to set up a machine for every single unit, right? So you can just do that for a batch, and then maybe you run a batch, you're done. But then you've got to change the configuration slightly. So that's a batch level. Product level is based on the product. So designs are different for each product. Facility level, cleaning the factory and providing electricity are two good examples of facility level. All right, the last thing we'll talk about, just real quick, is activity-based costing for service providers, because what we just talked about was manufacturing. We'll talk real quickly about service, because service companies can also use this too. They're also going to class their activities by unit, batch, service, and facility cost. So we'll just look at one example. You can look at the other ones if you want to pause. Sports arena. Now the unit level would be selling a ticket to a fan, right? Because they have to think of each ticket or each fan as a unit. Batch level would be hiring vendors and security for a game, because you don't have to do that for each fan. Service level, schedule a season of games. And then facility level, clean the arena, provide utilities, and update the website. So what about applying it? So again, just a kind of real quick example here. So we would follow the same steps, right? So we've got, like in this example, we've got 3 different activities, right? Clerical support, facility services, and client consultations. And we have our budgeted costs for those. And then we're looking at, okay, like what is driving these 3 activities? So for like clerical support, documents prepared, facility services, billable hours, client consultations, court dates. So we're saying like for clerical support, we've got 90 grand allocated. The cost driver is documents prepared, and they estimate 300 documents, right? So again, step 2, you're just going to divide them out, 90,000 divided by the 300, and then you're going to do the same for the other 2. And then once we get down to step 3, now we're looking at, well, what was the actual usage? So like documents, 225 and 75 for a total of 3. Remember, there were 300 documents. 2,400 billable hours in total. You can see that over here. Has that broken out between the 2 departments, litigation support and fraud investigation. So of the 2,400 hours, 975 went to litigation, 1,425 went to fraud investigation. And then for the court dates, 12, 10 for litigation support, and 2 for fraud investigation. And then all we have to do then is just multiply them out, right? So clerical support, 225 documents times 300 per document, 67.5. If we go back, you can see the 300 per document, right? 225, and then if we go back, and then the other fraud investigation, the other department, 75 documents times the same 300, 22.5, and it's the same logic for facility services and client consultations. So we have total allocated costs of 117 for litigation support, 57 for fraud investigation, and then we just divide it by the number of units produced, which in this case, of course, because it's contextual, is cases. So divided by 39, divided by 95, and then we get our overhead cost per case, 3,600 respectively. Okay, that's it for this video. As always, I will talk to you soon.